Welcome to the Point. The state legislature continues its march to put Democratic priorities in place this week. While the House took most of the week off, the Senate took on right to work and prevailing wage legislation. The measures passed on party line votes just as they did in the House. So too, the myriad amendments Republicans offered failed along party lines. There was no doubt that these bills would pass, but as I pointed out last week, they were brought to the floor just as gun legislation had been talked about for weeks by the Democratic majority and the governor, along with almost daily demonstrations in Lansing and elsewhere demanding action on the issue. The House dealt with background checks, and that passed more than a week ago. But before that could happen in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, for the second time in just over a decade, showed their deep divide over what is known as right to work. Republican Senate Leader Eric Nesbitt and Democratic Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks highlighted the two sides' differences.
Now, a decade ago, Mr. President, bloviating and pontificating politicians made all sorts of claims about what would happen if Michigan had the audacity to become a right-to-work state. Some charged that wages would decline. Others said working conditions and quality would suffer. One even made an outlandish threat that there will be blood. There will be repercussions. Well, it's been 10 years. And none of that has happened. What did happen? What did happen was Michigan was finally able, being considered and recognized as a place where it would no longer be detrimental to attempt to build a company and to invest and grow jobs and start a family. It became a place where growth was possible. What did happen? Tens of thousands of individual workers, 150,000 Michiganders made the free choice to leave their unions and negotiate for themselves, free of compulsive dues and restrictive and collectivist mandates. But that competitiveness, that economic growth, that freedom for workers all appear to be on the chopping block with this governor and this slim Democratic majorities.
The failed experiment of gutting Michigan workers' rights is soon to be over. We may have a slim majority, but we are prepared to act. 10 years is 10 years too long. I too was here on that day in 2012, and I had a much different experience than some of the previous speakers shared, the speakers from across the aisle. I will never forget the feeling I had sitting in the other chamber as a representative-elect, watching as thousands of workers' voices went ignored, as the building shook, and an unprecedented worker suppression bill passed with no hearing, a quick vote, and a swing of the gavel. The last administration's philosophy of cutting their way to success by cutting salaries, cutting workers' rights, and more never sat well with me. It's bad policy. But it's a new day here in Lansing, and today we are taking action to empower workers by restoring the rights that they always relied on, including the right to speak with one voice for better pay, benefits, safer working conditions. Colleagues, these bills are about restoring balance and making sure that the working people who make our state great are once again heard.
On Thursday, the Senate did act on the package of gun laws on straight party line votes that will head for final consideration next week. That will at very least create gun storage laws, red flag laws, and background checks. Next week's show will deal with that legislation. Up next, a presidential scholar has written a new eye-opening book about President Gerald R. Ford. Richard Norton Smith is my guest next. To the Point. We're pleased to be joined by Richard Norton Smith. You are an author, a presidential scholar, a biographer, director of multiple presidential museums. You have written a new book, and I want to put the book up right now and tell folks about this. It's called An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. Richard, it's so nice to have you back. We've talked many times, but it's been too long this time.
It has been too long, and it's nice to be back.
You have written this book, and you were kind enough to see that I got a copy of it. In full transparency, I did not read 700 pages in 2 or 3 days, but I did go through this book and find in almost every time I would open it, there was a nugget. Things that I thought I knew about President Ford, which seemed largely true and remains so, but you put so much extra information out there. Before we get to it, explain to me a little how that happened, because this was a multiple years labor to get this done and access to information that others have not previously had access to.
That's true. I mean, I guess you could say my timing was right. It's been about 10 years. I interviewed 160 plus people and then took thousands of pages of documentation, including a lot of material that has not been available until recently. I'll give you a good example. A lot of people are surprised when they find out just how broken a home Gerald Ford came out of. Of course, he wasn't born Gerald Ford. He was born Leslie King Jr. And the fact is, 2 weeks after his birth, his father walked into his mother's bedroom with a butcher knife and threatened to kill both of them. Dorothy, then King, later Dorothy Ford, was an extraordinary woman. I mean, she deserves a book herself.
Right.
I mean, 100 years ago, women did not have a lot of options. And I was the first person to see Gerald Ford's baby book. And inside, there's a very poignant page. It's marked Baby's First Automobile Ride. Baby's first automobile ride was when he was 2 weeks old. It was across the Mississippi River to a train station on the Iowa side of the river. His mother slipped out of the house, basically escaped with her infant son, went to Chicago where she had a sister who lived there. And that was the beginning of a much more eventful, and you have to say emotionally painful childhood than I think Ford ever talked about, or that most people were aware of.
Well, as you point out in your book, they didn't talk about it. I mean, this all was in Omaha, Nebraska. And she ends up back in Grand Rapids.
Came to Grand Rapids where she met, and interestingly enough, the Episcopal Church, because she was a divorced woman, would not allow her to be a member of the church. She could attend. Anyway, she met there Gerald Ford, who had his own secrets. One of the things that I discovered for the first time, and I think readers will, and the reason it matters is not because of the scandalous quality of the event, but because of the aftermath. Gerald Ford had a father, George Ford, who we now know was a bigamist, living in the St. Louis area with a woman who was not his wife. He was killed in a very suspicious train accident in 1909. The importance of that is because his son, who became Gerald Ford Sr., resolved from that point on that he was going to be the opposite of his father. And it was those values, the opposite of his father's values, Grand Rapids values, if you will, that he passed along to his stepson.
And that became the guiding force for President Ford. And he talked about it often, about the rules in their family home. And that's the things you did, the things you didn't do. And that's where he learned his life skills.
Work hard, tell the truth, and come to dinner on time.
Yeah, don't be late for dinner.
Which seems like a pretty simple philosophy. The interesting thing is behind that, the reality is that Gerald Ford was addressed as Junie until he was 15 years old. And he didn't know whether he was Junie Ford or Junie King. It's a much more, well, but here's the sequel to this. He said the one thing he inherited from his birth father was a temper. A lot of people didn't know. Someone who was close to Ford said he was 2% grizzly and 98% teddy bear. It's just you didn't know when the grizzly was going to emerge.
And you didn't want that 2%.
And that was his father's legacy to him. He spent a lifetime controlling his temper. But the legacy that really matters is this. His mother got a divorce, and the court ordered child support payments, which Ford's birth father never made. When Gerald Ford is elected to Congress in a big upset in 1948, one of the first things he does is introduce legislation. Now, this is in 1948 that would, in effect, federalize the whole child support process. Well, there was no way Congress was going to pass it. But the sequel has a sequel, because he'd only been president about 2 months when Congress passes basically the legislation that he had introduced in 1948. But typically, being Jerry Ford, he signed it, never said a word about why it had such a personal significance in his own life.
There was a very private side to President Ford, and it's not surprising coming from here and growing up like that. But I think if people at large think about President Ford, one of the first things that comes to mind is, oh, he replaced Richard Nixon when Richard Nixon resigned. That's fine, that's part of the story, but that's not near all of it, because he was on the front lines for every major political action of the 20th century. And one of the things that I read that I was surprised about was his prior knowledge or prior interest in what was going on in Cuba prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and why his inquiries may have actually had some impact on what the Kennedy administration did.
You see, by 1962, he'd been in Congress for 14 years, and he was regarded generally in a bipartisan way as the most knowledgeable Republican on defense issues and in many foreign policy issues. He had been put on the very select committee, 5 people from both parties, mostly old bulls and one promising junior member, who met once a year behind closed doors with no note takers, no staff, to perform oversight of CIA and other intelligence operations. So he was, for example, he knew about the U-2 flight before it was shot down in 1960. He had unparalleled connections, and he had unparalleled credibility. And in the summer of 1962, he, along with Senator Keating of New York, concluded, based on their information, that it was a distinct possibility that the Soviet Union was putting offensive nuclear weapons on the ground in Fidel Castro's Cuba. Well, no one was going to talk about it. The administration was not going to talk about it. Ford went to the then head of the CIA, a man named John McCone, who shared his concerns. And Ford then went to the Pentagon. And if you remember, Robert McNamara was from Michigan. McNamara and Ford had a close relationship, although different political outlooks. In any event, Ford went to the Pentagon and made sure that the message was delivered to the Kennedy White House that we need to step up the number of aerial reconnaissance flights over Cuba. And later on, John McCone of the CIA privately credited Ford with being the person more than anyone else who managed to increase the surveillance flights. And of course, it was those flights that eventually produced the evidence,
yeah, the pictures,
the famous photos that the Kennedy White House needed, basically to prevail.
It seems for many, I'm sure, like ancient history, but that was such a pivotal part of how our country has evolved, how we came all the way from World War II. And you talk about Jerry Ford and John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. They all came in. Ford was a couple of years after the other two, but all becoming presidents, all coming out of World War II mentality and then into the Cold War. But I have to confess, when I got to page 200, I stopped, because I wanted to read every word in there, because for more than 60 years, for people of a certain age, this has been a question, a mystery, and for some, a conspiracy. And it has to do with the assassination of President Kennedy and the Warren Commission that did that. President Johnson, as President Ford related to me, insisted that Ford, because of his credibility, then Congressman Ford, was going to be on that commission. In 1999, I had the distinct honor of sitting down with then former President Ford over at the Ford Museum. And I asked him about that. And I want you to listen to this because what he said, I think, is accurate, but it may not be complete as what you have put in your book. Let's take a listen to this from 1999.
I am the sole surviving member of the Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination of Kennedy. We undertook this duty. There were 7 of us at the insistence of President Johnson. We came up with what I think are 2 very important decisions. Number 1, that Lee Harvey Oswald committed the assassination. And secondly, the Warren Commission decided that we found no evidence of a conspiracy, foreign or domestic. I have seen no new evidence in the 30-some years that have transpired between Kennedy's assassination and today, no new evidence that would change my mind. I stand by and I am proud the job that the Warren Commission did. And I challenge anybody, including Oliver Stone, to show that our conclusions were inaccurate.
I let that run a little long because I wanted to line it about Oliver Stone because I found that interesting. But on page 220 in your book, you quote him as saying exactly what he said there. We said we found no evidence, but just before that he said, we didn't say there was no conspiracy.
No.
We said we found no evidence. And he had a lot of questions.
In fact, because he was the last surviving member, for the last 15 years of his life, he was the go-to guy. And whether you liked it or not, he was in effect the chief defender of the report. Well, it turns out he was, first of all, you have to know the background. He and John Kennedy were friends.
Their offices were right across
exactly.
the
They were
Jason.
neighbors in the House. When President Kennedy was in the White House, he turned to Ford more than once for help in getting legislation through. So there was a bipartisan relationship. There was a personal relationship. But when President Johnson asked him, he was of a generation who found it impossible to say no to a president, whatever the president asked. Okay. The fact of the matter is, however, at the beginning of this, and it went much longer than anyone thought it was going to, the investigation, Gerald Ford was the first, and I believe the last member of the commission who seriously entertained the possibility of a foreign conspiracy, who believed that Cuba and the Soviet Union might in fact have been responsible for the Kennedy assassination. There's a remarkable scene. He and Earl Warren were not simpatico. However, there's this amazing scene where they both go to Dallas, and they're in the Texas School Book Depository building. They actually ran from the top of the building down to the lobby with a stopwatch to make sure that, in fact, Oswald could have traversed that route in the time that it purportedly did. They then went over, and there's an amazing scene where they're interviewing Jack Ruby, the strange nightclub owner charged with killing Oswald on national television. And I have Ford's notes from, which again have not been available until now. And it starts off like a normal conversation. It goes on for 40 minutes or so. And finally, at the end, Ruby's lawyer passes Ford a note. And Ruby, who was missing nothing, out of the corner of his eye, he says, read the note. Well, the note says to Ford, says, see, I told you he was crazy.
And this is his attorney.
This is his attorney. Ford went to his grave believing the most likely rationale for an irrational act. He believed, and it's interesting because language like this would not have gotten into the report in 1964. He thought that Lee Harvey Oswald was sexually impotent and that he murdered President Kennedy in a desperate effort to impress his estranged Russian-born wife. It's a theory. But he also believed, as he said on the tape, he saw the Oliver Stone movie. He said he was part of a captive audience on an airplane. He had no choice. And he watched it, sat through it. He said, you know, it's a really good movie. It's just really bad history. And he was really concerned that young people in particular would see the movie and take it to heart.
And they did.
So, and you know, to this day. Yeah.
I want to talk about a very pivotal moment in our country's history, a very pivotal moment in the life of Gerald Ford, and the backstory that I don't think we knew about this. President Ford, as the story has been told, and for a long time over in the museum, there was a tally card that he had taken around to a number of members of Congress and said, hey, who do you think should be the vice president of the United States? There were a lot of familiar names on there. I think George Bush was on there, maybe Ronald Reagan, a number of names that you would remember from the time. But at the end of the day, the number one name that came back that he took back to give to President Nixon was Gerald Ford. And that was at what we knew about that. But that was not the first that Gerald Ford knew about Spiro Agnew's problems or the fact that he might be departing.
If you read the Ford memoir, he says that he found out in August, which was just days before the Wall Street Journal went public with the story that the Vice President of the United States was in serious legal jeopardy for basically bribery, among other things. I dug up, I shouldn't say dug up, but I found two eyewitnesses who have never spoken until now, almost 50 years later, one of whom, in fact, became the deputy press secretary in the Ford White House, but who at the time was press secretary to the Attorney General of the United States. And the other was a gentleman who had worked for Bob Griffin in the United States Senate and was very well plugged in. In any event, they confirmed each other's story. Gerald Ford was told in detail about Agnew's problems at least 6 months earlier than he ever acknowledged publicly. And from the beginning, he could see Agnew going down, and he could see himself replacing Agnew. Ford was a much more ambitious figure. I mean, people have all forgotten now, in 1960, he actually launched a campaign to be Richard Nixon's running mate in that year's election. So, yes, he wanted to be Speaker of the House. By 1974, he realized he was never going to realize that goal. And to be Vice President would be a nice way to crown his career. He had already promised Mrs. Ford that he would retire in 1976. And but the vice presidency, he was not Richard Nixon's preference. Richard Nixon wanted John Connally.
Right.
John Connally could not be confirmed. Right. He was a former Democrat, recently turned Republican. He made a lot of people think Texas wheeler dealer. They closed their eyes and they could hear Lyndon Johnson's voice.
And I think when he ran for president, he got exactly one delegate.
Yeah.
Cost him several $1 million.
Absolutely.
We're running out of time. I got to do this really quickly. It's long been the subject of conversation about was there some quid pro quo when it came to him becoming president, Richard Nixon leaving. You write in this book of the tale of two phone calls, depending on whose version you believe. In one, then Vice President Ford is very firm and says there is no deal, there's not going to be a deal, we're going to talk about this. And another, Al Haig, who is a velour in a number of administration, calls and talks about making some kind of a deal. At the bottom of that page, which I think is page 326, you say the reader is free to make their decision based on that. And I found that interesting because...
Well, I'm not going to tell the reader what to think. Personally, I think Al Haig's word is not something I would bet the family farm on. I can take a copy of Al Haig's memoir and point to 2 pages, 10 pages apart, where he says contradictory things. Here's what I think happened. Al Haig concluded, in fact, one of the lines that has never appeared until now, Haig says at one point near the end, this guy has lied to me for the last time. And he had concluded that it was in the country's interest for Richard Nixon to go. But he had to find a way to make that happen. And Richard Nixon didn't want to go. Richard Nixon's family did not want him to go. And what Haig did was first try to enlist a number of people around Nixon, including, by the way, Senator Griffin from Michigan, who took the bait, wrote a letter to Nixon, and of course it had exactly the opposite of the intended. Nixon blew up, and Ford was shrewd enough to know, first of all, he thought as vice president it was utterly inappropriate for him to be telling the president what to do. And I think Haig miscalculated there. The other thing is, Haig, there's no doubt Haig brought up the possibility of a pardon. Nixon said, I'll have to think this over. I have to talk it over with Betty, and I want to talk to the White House lawyers. That, when you know Gerald Ford, was exactly how you would expect him to respond, whatever the issue. And you saw it throughout his presidency. He was someone who liked to listen. He preferred listening to reading, but he welcomed vigorous debate in front of him, but he would never give his answer at that moment. He would think about it and 24 hours later let people know. In effect, but you're right, this has become enormously, I won't say blown out of proportion, because it's a critical turning point in the story. But I think it's absolutely typical of Ford to say, and then the real person I think who sort of deserves credit is Mrs. Ford. She's quoted for the first time ever in this book as saying, Haig offered a deal. Jerry came home. We talked about it. I said, you couldn't do that. He agreed. I think that's pretty much what happened.
We are out of time. I wish we had more, because then we would talk about the influence of Betty Ford on the presidency and on the president's life. I hope you'll come back and talk again. Richard Norton Smith, the author of a new book, An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald Ford. It's great to see you again, and thank you for coming in. Good luck with this book.
Thank you so much for your interest.
Next week, a look at the Democrats in Lansing almost unilateral string of votes on major legislation, what the bills will do and what impact it has on this legislative session very early on. We'll see you then. To the point.